This is HOA rulebook. They wanted control. You are not going to pretend you did not hear me. That is what Melissa screamed at me across the mailbox cluster, waving a tow invoice packet like a weapon, her tiny body camera clipped to her windbreaker catching every word. I had just finished loading my mail into my jacket pocket when she appeared, blocking the path back to my car, her chin-length bob swinging as she jabbed a finger at the packet. The invoice was for a tow that never happened, a charge I had already disputed twice, and here she was demanding payment in front of 3 neighbors and the mail carrier who was trying to get around us. I kept my car key fob clenched in my fist and told myself to stay calm, because I knew what this was. This was the same playbook she had used on another neighbor 2 years ago, and that case never got solved. But this time, I was going to reopen the file. My name is irrelevant. What matters is I live in Canyon Springs, a subdivision in Madison, Wisconsin, where selective enforcement ramps up the moment you push back. I work as a telecom project coordinator, which means I live in spreadsheets and logs, and I am very good at tracking patterns. Melissa Howard is the neighborhood watch liaison for the Canyon Springs Community Association, and she treats residents like suspects. She has been on the board for 4 years, and in that time, at least 6 homeowners have complained about harassment, backdated violations, and mysterious fees that appear out of nowhere. Most of them paid and moved on. One of them, a guy named Trevor, fought back 2 years ago and suddenly had his car towed 3 times in 1 month, all for violations that were not in the covenants when he moved in. The towing stopped when he sold his house and left. Nobody ever figured out who was behind it, but I always suspected Melissa. Now she was doing it to me. And I had one advantage Trevor did not have. I kept records of everything. Melissa stepped closer, her sun hat casting a shadow across her face, and said, "You signed the covenants. Now you live the covenants." Her voice was loud enough that the mail carrier stopped moving entirely. I kept my voice level and said the tow never happened, my car was never moved, and I had photos proving it was parked legally in my driveway the entire night in question. She snorted and said the invoice was proof enough, and if I did not pay by Friday, she would escalate it to collections. I asked her to show me the section of the covenants that allowed charges for a tow that did not occur. She said, "Go ahead and call whoever you want. I have a committee for that." That line hit me like a brick, because I remembered Trevor telling me she had said the exact same thing to him before his car got towed the first time. It was not just a threat. It was a signature move, and I filed it away for later. I told her I would be filing a formal dispute with the management office, and she laughed. She said if I filed 1 complaint, she would file 3 complaints back. Then she turned and walked away, her body camera still recording, leaving me standing there with the mail carrier staring at me like I had just poked a bear. The carrier, a woman in her 50s with a USPS vest, shook her head and said quietly, "Last guy who asked for records got targeted next." Then she walked off before I could ask her what she meant. I stood there for a moment, letting the adrenaline drain, and pulled out my phone. I took a photo of the mailbox cluster, the exact spot where Melissa had confronted me, and noted the time. 2047 p.m. Then I got in my car and drove straight to the management office, because the office closed at 500 and I had 1 shot to deliver the dispute packet in person. The management office for Canyon Springs is on the south side of Madison, a bland beige building with a lobby that always smells like burnt coffee and cheap air freshener. I walked in at 3:15 with my phone camera ready and my jacket pocket stuffed with printouts. The receptionist, a tired-looking guy named Derek, glanced up and said, "Let me guess, Melissa." I nodded. He sighed and slid a dispute form across the counter. I filled it out on the spot, referencing the tow invoice by date and charge code, and attached 3 photos showing my car in my driveway with timestamps matching the alleged tow window. Derek took the packet, stamped it with a loud thunk, and said he would forward it to the board. I asked if I could get a copy of the complaint log for my address, and he hesitated. Then he said he would have to check with the supervisor, and he disappeared into the back office. While I waited, I pulled up my phone notes and started listing everything I knew about Trevor's case. He had been hit with 3 violations in 1 week: parking on the street overnight, lawn height exceeding 2 inches above the covenant limit, and a mailbox post that was allegedly the wrong color. All 3 were borderline calls, and all 3 came with photos attached to the notices, but the photos were taken at angles that made it impossible to verify the measurements or the exact color. Trevor had paid the first 2 fines and repainted his mailbox post, but then a 4th violation appeared. His trash cans were visible from the street on a non-collection day. That one came with a tow threat if he did not move them within 24 hours. He moved them, but 2 days later his car was towed anyway, for a parking violation that was never documented. The tow company said the HOA had called it in. Trevor filed a complaint with the management office, and the complaint vanished. No response, no hearing, no records. He tried to escalate to the board, and Melissa told him his complaint was unfounded because the covenants allowed the board to act on behalf of the community without individual notice in cases of repeat violations. Trevor did not have a lawyer, and he could not afford to keep fighting, so he sold his house 6 months later. Derek came back with a single sheet of paper and slid it across the counter. It was a complaint log entry for my address, dated 3 days ago, and the description was one sentence: resident failed to comply with parking covenant section 4.2 and refused verbal warning. The writing style was unmistakable. It was Melissa's voice, the same clipped phrasing she used when she yelled at people in public. I took a photo of the log entry and asked Derek if there were any other complaints on file for my address. He checked his screen and said no. Just that one. I asked if I could see the complaint that triggered Trevor's tow 2 years ago, and his face went blank. He said those records were archived and he would need supervisor approval to pull them. I thanked him and left, knowing I had just hit my first clue. Melissa was writing her own complaints and backdating the log entries. I got back to my car and checked my phone battery. 32%. I had been recording nonstop since the mailbox confrontation, and the battery was dropping fast. I plugged it into the car charger and sat there for a moment, staring at the management office building, trying to decide my next move. The renovation schedule for my house was in week 3, and any delays would cost me thousands in contractor penalties and material storage fees. I could not afford to let this drag out, and I knew Melissa was counting on that. She wanted me to fold, pay the fake invoice, and move on. But I had something she did not know about. I had kept every email, every notice, and every receipt related to my HOA account, going back to the day I moved in. And buried in that file was a records request response I had received 4 months ago when I asked for a copy of the current covenants. The response had included 2 different versions of the same meeting minutes, one dated March 2023 and one dated March 2024, and both claimed to be the official record of a parking rule amendment. The amendment was the one Melissa kept quoting, the one that allowed overnight street parking to be treated as a violation without prior notice. But the 2 versions had different vote counts, and one of them was missing a signature. I stayed polite, because polite makes bullies careless. That was my internal mantra, and I repeated it every time Melissa pushed. I knew if I stayed calm and kept digging, she would eventually make a mistake big enough that I could trap her. I drove home, parked in my driveway, and spent the next 2 hours building a case file. I printed every email, every notice, every invoice, and every photo. I organized them in a 3-ring binder with color-coded tabs: tow invoice, complaint log, records request, meeting minutes, Trevor case notes. The binder was thick enough to use as a weapon, and when I held it under the bright midday light streaming through my kitchen window, the tabs popped like a rainbow. I took a photo of the binder on my kitchen table and sent it to my ally, a homeowner named Greg who was popular in the neighborhood and had a reputation for turning board meetings into chaos when he smelled corruption. Greg texted back in under a minute, "Holy crap, you went full cold case files." I replied that I needed his help at the next board meeting, and he said he was already planning to attend because Melissa had tried to fine him last month for a fence post that was 6 inches too tall. He told me he had refused to pay and she had backed down, but only because he had threatened to call a special election to remove her from the board. He said she was scared of elections because her voting block was smaller than she pretended. That gave me an idea. If I could get enough homeowners to show up at the meeting and demand an audit, Melissa would be forced to produce records. And those records would either prove she was falsifying complaints, or they would expose gaps that I could exploit. I asked Greg if he could rally 5 or 6 people, and he said he could rally 10 if I gave him something concrete to work with. I told him I would have it by tomorrow. That night, I went through Trevor's old emails. He had forwarded me his entire HOA correspondence file after he moved out, saying he hoped someone would use it someday. Most of it was routine stuff, but buried in the middle was a thread where he had asked the management office for a copy of the tow authorization form. The office had replied that no such form existed, and that tow requests were handled verbally by the board liaison. That was Melissa's role. Trevor had pushed back, asking for the name of the person who called the tow company, and the office had replied that the information was confidential under the covenants. But Trevor had saved the tow company invoice, and it included a reference number. I pulled up my own fake tow invoice and compared the reference numbers. They were sequential, only 3 digits apart, and both were dated within the same week 2 years ago. That meant the tow company had a record of both calls, and if I could get them to confirm who made the calls, I would have proof that Melissa was behind both incidents. I called the tow company the next morning and asked to speak to the dispatch manager. The guy who answered said his name was Ron, and he sounded annoyed before I even started talking. I explained that I had received a tow invoice for a vehicle that was never towed, and I needed to verify the authorization. Ron asked for the reference number, and I read it off. He put me on hold for 3 minutes, and when he came back, he said the call had been logged as a board-authorized removal, caller name Melissa Howard, and the vehicle description did not match any vehicle registered to my address. I asked him to email me a copy of the dispatch log, and he said he could not do that without a subpoena or a signed release from the HOA. I thanked him and hung up, because I had just confirmed 2 things. Melissa had called in both tows, and the tow company had records proving it. The next step was to force Melissa to commit to her story in front of witnesses. I texted Greg and told him to meet me at the mailbox cluster at 4:00 p.m. and to bring his phone on speaker mode. He replied, "This is going to be good." I drove to the cluster at 3:55 and parked where I could see the whole area. Melissa showed up at 4003, walking from her house 2 streets over, carrying a clipboard and wearing her body camera again. She saw me and immediately started yelling, asking why I had not paid the invoice yet. I stayed calm and said I was waiting for proof that the tow actually happened. She said the invoice was proof, and I said an invoice is not proof of service, it is just a bill. She said, "You signed the covenants, now you live the covenants." I pulled out my phone and said I wanted to call the tow company with her standing there, so we could verify the details together. She hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything. Greg walked up at that exact moment, phone in hand, and said, "Hey, I want to hear this too. If you are enjoying this HOA cold case investigation, hit that like button and subscribe for more wild neighborhood drama and satisfying endings." Melissa looked at Greg, then at me, then at the phone in my hand and said, "I do not have time for this." I said it would only take 2 minutes and I dialed the tow company on speaker. Ron answered and I said I had a question about reference number 847219. He sighed and said, "I already told you. That call was logged as board authorized by Melissa Howard." I looked directly at Melissa and said, "Can you confirm you made that call?" She froze. Greg held up his phone, still recording, and said, "Yeah, Melissa. Can you confirm that?" She said, "This is harassment, and you are both violating the covenants by recording me without consent." Greg laughed and said, "Wisconsin is a one-party consent state, and I am a party to this conversation, so we are good." Melissa turned and walked away fast, clipboard clutched to her chest, her body camera bouncing. Ron was still on the line, and he said, "Is there anything else?" I said no, thanked him, and hung up. Greg looked at me and said, "You just got her on tape lying about a toe. What is next?" I told Greg the plan. We needed to get the board to vote on an audit, and we needed to do it at the next meeting, which was in 3 days. He said he could get 12 people to show up, and I said that would be enough if we coordinated. I spent the next 2 days pulling together the rest of the case file. I requested a copy of the minutes from the March 2023 meeting and the March 2024 meeting, and I got both versions back from the management office. I laid them side by side and highlighted the differences. The 2023 version showed a 3-2 vote in favor of the parking amendment, with Melissa voting yes. The 2024 version showed a 4-1 vote, also with Melissa voting yes, but the fourth yes vote was signed by a board member who had resigned in 2022. That was my trump card. The amendment Melissa kept quoting was never properly adopted because the 2024 version was a forgery, and the 2023 version did not have enough votes to pass under the covenants, which required a supermajority of 4 votes for any rule change. The meeting was held in the community center, a low-ceilinged room with folding chairs and a folding table up front where the 5 board members sat. Melissa was on the left end, next to the HOA president, a retired accountant named Paul who always looked like he wished he were anywhere else. Greg and I sat in the front row, and behind us were 14 other homeowners, including 2 people I had never seen at a meeting before. Melissa saw the crowd and her face went tight. Paul called the meeting to order and started with the usual reports: budget update, landscaping contract renewal, upcoming holiday decorations policy. Melissa kept glancing at me, and I kept my binder on my lap, tabs facing out where she could see them. When Paul opened the floor for new business, Greg stood up and said, "I move that the board authorize an independent audit of all enforcement actions taken in the past 3 years, with a focus on towing authorizations and complaint log entries." Melissa stood up immediately and said, "That motion is out of order." Greg said, "Why?" Melissa said because enforcement actions are confidential under the covenants and cannot be audited without board approval. Greg said, "I am asking for board approval, that is what a motion is." Paul looked uncomfortable and said, "We can vote on it." Melissa said, "I object." Paul said, "Your objection is noted, but we still need a vote." Melissa sat down hard, and I could see her jaw clenching. Paul called for a vote, and 3 board members voted yes, including Paul himself. Melissa voted no, and the 5th member abstained. The motion passed 3-1-1. Melissa stood up again and said, "I demand to know the basis for this audit request." Greg looked at me, and I stood up, holding my binder. I said, "The basis is a pattern of backdated complaints, falsified tow authorizations, and forged meeting minutes." Melissa said, "That is slander." I said, "It is not slander if I can prove it." I opened the binder to the tab-marked meeting minutes and pulled out both versions of the March amendment. I held them up and said, "These are 2 different versions of the same meeting minutes, both claiming to be official, both showing different vote counts, and one of them is signed by a board member who resigned before the meeting took place." I walked to the front table and laid both pages down in front of Paul. He picked them up, compared them, and his face went pale. Melissa said, "Those are drafts." I said, "They are both stamped as final by the management office, and the dates match." Paul looked at Melissa and said, "Did you submit 2 versions?" Melissa said, "I submitted corrections after the original was filed." Paul said, "You cannot correct a vote count after the fact." Melissa said, "The original had a clerical error." I said, "A clerical error that added a vote from a board member who was not present?" The room went silent. Paul set the minutes down and said, "We are going to table this discussion until we can review the records." Melissa said, "There is nothing to review." I said, "Then you will not mind if I request the original sign-in sheet from that meeting, along with the agenda packet and the proxy forms." Melissa looked at me like I had just pulled a gun, and I knew I had her. Paul said, "We will include that in the audit scope." Melissa stood up, grabbed her bag, and said, I am done with this meeting." She walked out, and the room stayed silent until the door slammed behind her. Paul looked at me and said, "Can you leave those minutes with me?" I said yes, and I also handed him a USB drive with scanned copies of every document in my binder, including the tow company dispatch log summary and the complaint log entry with Melissa's writing style. Paul took the drive and said, "We will schedule a follow-up meeting in 2 weeks." I sat down, and Greg leaned over and whispered, "You just nuked her." I whispered back, "Not yet. We still have to survive the next 2 weeks." Because I knew Melissa was not going to take this quietly, and I was right. The next morning, I found a certified letter in my mailbox, postmarked the day before the meeting, claiming I owed $450 in accumulated late fees for unpaid assessments. I checked my bank records and saw that every single assessment had cleared on time, with confirmation numbers and dates. I took screenshots and emailed them to Paul, copying the entire board. Melissa replied all within an hour, saying the bank confirmations did not match the HOA records, and I needed to provide additional proof. I replied all with the full email headers from my bank showing the transaction IDs and processing timestamps, and I said, "If the HOA records do not match, then the HOA records are wrong." Paul replied, saying he would forward the issue to the management office for reconciliation. Melissa did not reply. 2 days later, I got a notice taped to my front door, claiming my lawn was in violation of the height covenant. I had mowed 3 days earlier, and the grass was under 2 inches. I took photos with a ruler and frame and emailed them to Paul, again copying the board. Melissa replied all, saying the photos were taken at an angle that made accurate measurement impossible, and she was scheduling a site inspection for the following morning. I replied all, saying I would be present for the inspection and I expected a written report with measurements and photos. The inspection never happened. Instead, I got another certified letter the next day, this time threatening to send my account to collections unless I paid the disputed tow invoice and the late fees within 72 hours. I called Paul directly and said, "This is retaliation, and it is escalating." Paul said, "I know, and I am working on it." I asked what that meant, and he said the management company was reviewing Melissa's role and considering a suspension. I asked how long that would take, and he said, longer than 72 hours. Greg called me that night and said he had heard from another homeowner that Melissa was circulating a petition to recall the board members who voted for the audit. I asked how many signatures she had, and he said maybe 4, all from her voting block. He said, "She is panicking, and panicking people make mistakes." I said, "I need her to make one more big mistake. Something public." Greg said, "You mean like showing up at your house with a megaphone?" I said, "Has she done that before?" Greg said twice. Once to announce a rules change, and once to shame someone for parking on the street during a snowstorm. I said, "If she does it at my house, I want you recording from across the street." Greg said, "Say when." The 72-hour deadline hit on a Friday afternoon. I did not pay because I was not going to reward extortion. At 4:30 p.m., I heard a voice amplified by a megaphone coming from my front yard. I looked out the window and saw Melissa standing on the sidewalk, holding a battery-powered megaphone and reading from a script. She was announcing that I was in violation of multiple covenants, that my account was delinquent, and that the HOA would be pursuing all available remedies including liens and legal action. 3 neighbors came out of their houses to watch. Greg was across the street with his phone up, recording. I grabbed my phone, opened the camera, and walked outside. I said, "Melissa, what are you doing?" She lowered the megaphone and said, "I am exercising my authority as neighborhood watch liaison." I said, "You are trespassing on my property and harassing me in front of witnesses." She said, "The sidewalk is public property." I said, "You are not a public official, you are an HOA board member, and this is not an official HOA function." She raised the megaphone again and said, "You signed the covenants, Now you live the covenants. I looked directly at Greg, who was still recording, and said loud enough for everyone to hear. For the record, I have bank confirmation showing all assessments were paid on time, photos showing my lawn is in compliance, and a dispatch log from the tow company proving the tow Melissa authorized never happened. Ed. Melissa lowered the megaphone and said, "You do not have any such log." I said, "Yes, I do, and I have the dispatch manager on record confirming you called in 2 separate fraudulent tow requests. One for me and one for Trevor Harris 2 years ago." Melissa's face went white. She said, "That is a lie." I said, "Then you will not mind if I submit the recording to the board and the management company." She turned off the megaphone, shoved it under her arm, and walked away fast, leaving the paper fluttering to the ground. I picked up the paper. It was a script printed on HOA letterhead with bullet points listing my alleged violations. None of them were true, and all of them referenced rule sections that did not exist in the current covenants. I took a photo of the script and texted it to Paul. He replied, "Meeting tomorrow at 10 a.m. Management office. Mandatory attendance for all board members." I said, "I will be there." Greg walked over and said that was the best episode of Neighborhood Court I have ever seen. I said, "It is not over yet." Greg said, "I know, but she just made it personal in front of 5 witnesses, and that is going to cost her." The next morning, I showed up at the management office at 9,045 with my binder, my phone, and Greg as my witness. Paul was already there along with 2 other board members and the management company supervisor, a woman named Linda who looked like she had not slept in a week. Melissa arrived at 9,058. No megaphone this time, but still wearing her body camera. Paul started by saying the board had reviewed the audit request and the supporting documents, and the management company had found multiple discrepancies in the enforcement records. Linda took over and said, "We have identified at least 7 instances where complaint log entries were backdated, 5 instances where tow authorizations were issued without proper verification, and 2 instances where meeting minutes were altered after filing." She paused and looked at Melissa. She said, "All of these instances trace back to one board member." Melissa said, "I want to see the evidence." Linda slid a folder across the table. Melissa opened it, flipped through 3 pages, and her face went red. She said, "This is a witch hunt." Paul said, "It is an audit you voted against." Melissa said, "Because it is a waste of resources." Paul said, "The resources we are wasting are on fixing the mess you created." Linda said, "We have also been contacted by the tow company, and they have agreed to cooperate with a full review of all dispatch calls made by HOA representatives." Melissa stood up and said, "I am not going to sit here and be accused of fraud." Paul said, "Sit down, Melissa." She did not sit. She said, "You cannot force me to stay." Paul said, "If you leave, I will recommend the board vote to remove you for cause." Melissa sat down. Paul looked at me and said, "Do you have anything to add?" I said, "Yes." I opened my binder to the tab-marked trump card. I pulled out a bank confirmation letter showing my HOA payments had cleared on the dates I claimed, and the HOA account ledger showing the same payments marked as late 2 weeks after they were received. I said, "This proves the HOA deliberately marked my payments late to justify fees." I also pulled out the dispatch log summary from the tow company, showing Melissa's name as the caller for both my fake tow and Trevor's real tow. I said, "This proves Melissa authorized fraudulent tows." And finally, I pulled out the 2 versions of the meeting minutes, side by side, and I said, "This proves the parking amendment Melissa keeps quoting was never properly adopted, which means every violation based on that amendment is invalid." I slid all 3 documents across the table to Paul. He looked at them, then at Linda, then at Melissa. He said, "Linda, what is the management company's recommendation?" Linda said, "We recommend immediate suspension of enforcement authority for the board member in question, pending a full investigation. We also recommend the HOA retain outside counsel to review potential legal exposure." Paul said, "I move we adopt that recommendation." The other two board members said, "Second," and agreed. Paul looked at Melissa and said, "You are suspended, effective immediately." Melissa said, "You cannot do this." Paul said, "We just did." Melissa grabbed her bag and walked out without another word. The door slammed, and the room stayed quiet for a beat. Then Linda said, "We will issue a formal notice to all homeowners explaining the suspension and the audit findings." Paul said, "And we will issue refunds for any fees that were improperly assessed." I said, "What about the people who paid under duress and moved out?" Paul said, "We will reach out to them if we can find current contact information." Linda said, "We will also be terminating our contract with the tow company pending the investigation results." I said, "Good, because they were complicit." Linda nodded and said, "We know." I left the meeting feeling like I had just run a marathon. Greg met me in the parking lot and said, "So, did you win?" I said, "I think so." He said, "You think so? You just got her suspended and exposed a fraud scheme. That is a win." I said, "It is a win if it sticks." Greg said, "It will stick. She recorded herself threatening you with a megaphone in front of witnesses. She is done." 2 weeks later, the board held a special meeting to present the audit findings. 32 homeowners showed up, the biggest turnout in Canyon Springs history. Paul read a summary of the report, which confirmed everything I had documented: backdated complaints, fraudulent tows, forged minutes, and selective enforcement targeting homeowners who pushed back. The report also revealed that Melissa had been receiving kickbacks from the tow company, a flat fee per tow regardless of whether the tow was legitimate. The board voted unanimously to terminate Melissa's position and refer the matter to local authorities for potential criminal charges. The management company was fired and replaced with an interim manager who froze all enforcement actions until a full policy audit could be completed. Melissa tried to fight back by filing a defamation lawsuit against me and Greg, but her own body camera footage from the megaphone incident proved the opposite of her claim. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, and Melissa was ordered to pay legal fees. She moved out of Canyon Springs 3 months later. The HOA issued refunds to everyone who had been charged under the invalid parking amendment, and the board passed a new rule requiring all enforcement actions to be reviewed by an independent third party before notices could be issued. Greg got elected to the board in the next election, and his first act was to propose a budget review that revealed vendor favoritism across multiple contracts. The tow company lost the HOA account, and the landscaping company that Melissa had been pushing for years was replaced after the audit showed they were charging double the market rate. I got my refund check, cleared my account, and finished my renovation on schedule. Every time I drive past the mailbox cluster now, I think about that moment when Melissa tried to shame me in front of the neighborhood and ended up exposing herself instead. It turns out selective enforcement does have consequences, and sometimes the cold case you reopen is the one that takes down the person who thought they were untouchable. See you next time, and until then, take care of yourself.